Do church mergers work? We're asking that question today on the Church Revitalization podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization podcast, brought to you by the Malphurs Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Welcome to the Church Revitalization podcast. My name is Scott Ball, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, AJ Matthew. Welcome to the podcast, AJ.
Nice week. It's tan flannel week here on the podcast. If you're not watching,
That's
on
right.
YouTube.
Yeah, if you're tuning in on YouTube, AJ and I look like we coordinated the colors of our shirts.
So be sure to jump over there to YouTube, click on over to that version of this, and you will enjoy.
Is that your selling point?
Hey, that's it. Hey, like tan flannel? Join us today on the Church Revitalization podcast.
Oh, goodness. So maybe we had a little bit of a mind merge when selecting our shirts today, but that's not the kind of merging we're talking about.
Oh,
how's
that's
that for a
skillful segue? Love that.
Today we're talking about, do church mergers work? That's the question. And transparency here, we are discussing, our discussion on this is a kind of fueled by an excerpt from the book Look Before You Lead, which is a book by Aubrey Malphurs on culture, church culture. So the majority of the book is on how to shift your church's culture, how to discern your church's culture, and these things. But towards the end of the book, there's a question of some practical questions like about church mergers. So culture is a huge issue as it relates to church mergers, as we'll talk about here in a second. And he asked the question, do church mergers work? And we thought this would be a good thing to talk about, because I know the evidence suggests, AJ, that thousands and thousands of churches consider a merger every single year. And so odds are maybe one of our churches listening has considered adopting or merging in the past or in the future, or will in the future.
Yeah, I think we've got some good points today on first, we're going to talk a few points about why church mergers typically don't work, or points of failure, and then some of the options or considerations in making them work. There's not a ton of information really available on this. I mean, there's some anecdotal things, case studies that you can find online to read about this. A handful
of books on the topic.
Yeah. It's not an overly researched topic like church planting and other things that are more prevalent in the church going back a long ways. But I think you can certainly find some success stories and some failures. And I think these are some really good points that would probably help avoid some pitfalls. And so if you're considering a church merger, I think we have some good information for you today to consider. And hopefully you could find the right partner to make this happen for your church, either no matter what side you're on, feeling like you would just like to merge with a church because you're healthy and would like to bring that church in, or if you're an unhealthy church, you're just having it on the table as one of the possible options for you going forward. I think we got some good points.
Yeah, so let's start with, you kind of hinted at this already, but the question to start this off was, do church mergers work? And the simple answer to it is many times the answer is no, they don't work. But there are key reasons why they don't work. They're very specific reasons, and they are things that you can avoid. So let's start there, AJ, with these sort of three reasons why, when they fail, why do they fail? Let's start there.
Yeah, so the first point that Aubrey has out of the book here is that they're going into it with a survival mentality. And this would be really hard not to have, actually, don't you think, Scott? That because when churches have declined and they're starting to talk about what are our options, we're really far gone, what are our options? Survival mentality is difficult to avoid. That's what brings these questions up to begin with, especially in the churches that we talk with frequently in regards to revitalization, is what can we do to keep our church from dying? So that's an understandable position that you may be entering into a merger discussion coming from. But the right way of focus, I love this sentence actually that Aubrey wrote in here. is that the key motivation must be mission or vision driven, and that mission or vision focuses on the Great Commission, which involves, listen to this, revival, not survival. I think that's a great line. So entering into a merger, just saying, will this help us survive, is the wrong way to frame the question. It's, will this revive our church so that we can be about making maturing disciples of Jesus?
Yeah. There's so many things we could say here, but there is a real key difference between a church that's alive versus a church that's just not dead. There's a distinction there.
Yeah.
And it's a significant one. And so this is true in revitalization too. So many churches are just trying to avoid death and not really becoming alive, and really growing and thriving. And so it's going to be just a nail in the coffin if you're just essentially merging to go on life support and to extend the life of the church, or prolong the death of the church, I should say, by just a little bit. It's unlikely to work. And sadly, very often that is the core motivation is, hey, let's just keep the doors open a few more years.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Our second point here on why the mergers may not work is the lack of leadership. And as Aubrey describes it, turnaround leadership, leaders or a pastor who has the qualities to turn an organization around. And so lacking that will likely lead to an unsuccessful merger outcome. Have we ever done an episode, Scott, simply on turnaround pastor characteristics and qualities? That might be a future episode.
Maybe in the first year of the podcast.
Sort of
It'd be a good one to
we'll
bring back up.
That.
Yeah, this is okay. So I think Aubrey makes a fantastic point, and it's well said, and it's worth noting here that if you have two pastors, you're merging two churches, right? And neither pastor was able to lead their church to thrive, regardless of, assuming that one of those people steps down and the other pastor becomes the pastor. Now you're just, what makes you think that anything's going to be any different?
Yeah. If
you weren't able to lead your church into revitalization, why now is this going to work? And then that's compounded often by if the now combined church tries to keep both pastors in some capacity, that creates some alliance issues where, well, this is my pastor and that's your pastor, or there's a co-pastor type situation and that never works. So on top of all the relational issues that it creates in leadership, there's also a function question in leadership. Does this person really have the skills? So if you're going to merge, you very likely need a new pastor who has that skill set, who can take the merged church and lead it in a new direction. Apart from that, it's almost assuredly going to fail.
Yeah, that's right. The third thing here on why it may not work is disparate culture. So not having enough alignment between the cultures of the two churches. One of the things that he mentions in here is no alignment between beliefs and values. And I think you need to break those down separately as well, because two churches could have very similar beliefs, and a lot of evangelical churches would have alignment on beliefs, but on the value side of the equation, it would be necessary to deconstruct what your values are prior to entering into a merger. And what I mean by that is, even if the church maybe had some stated values that it created many years ago, I think it would be worth taking the time to, what I mean by deconstruct the values is look at how the church has actually been functioning. What were the ministries that it was engaged in? What was it actually living out day to day? And what alignment do you have between the two churches there? So if you don't find those were very similar, then that may be a problem. Now, if both churches were simply living out really not healthy values, that also, it doesn't, just because you're both doing the same unhealthy things doesn't mean you're a match made in heaven. So it would be worth the task of deconstructing the present values of both congregations to see if there are healthy values that, if brought together, would make one larger healthy organization. And the values dictate, values indicate at least, or drive the culture of the church. They're connected together. So trying to determine what is our culture? Well, what do we do? What are we living out? And simply alignment isn't enough. Health is the necessary component.
Yeah. And, this is kind of a deep dive, I guess, a little bit on the book. And I really recommend, again, checking out the book, Look Before You Lead. But there's a distinction here too, not just certainly included in your beliefs is going to be your theological convictions and beliefs. But as Aubrey describes in the book, it's not just that. Your beliefs go deeper than that. Your beliefs are he calls them the unquestioned assumptions that the church has. So obviously that's going to, the theology is going to be an aspect of that potentially, but also a worldview, like what is reality? What matters most in the world? These kinds of things lie deeper. And so when there's a mismatch on those beliefs, the ones that are not just the ones that you would post on the website, but they're the things that they do take some investigation, AJ, to figure out, well, hold on a minute, what do we really believe about the world that are not the things that we could just get from a textbook, but these are unquestioned assumptions we have about the nature of culture or the world. And when there's a mismatch on that level, that fundamental level, it really does cause problems.
Yeah, for sure. So these are the three elements that are more likely to make a merger not successful. And that's having a survival mentality rather than a Great Commission focused revival mentality, not having leaders in place that could turn around a declining or unhealthy organization, and not having cultures, healthy cultures that are in alignment with one another that would cause a rift between congregations and people after a merger that would end up tearing it down. So we're going to shift now into making mergers work. We've got 5 points on making mergers work that if these elements are there, the likelihood of success greatly increases. Yes.
Yeah.
So the first one here is, as the opposite of what was spoken on the first one, a revival mentality. And again, this is having this Great Commission focused organization that desires to reach people with the gospel. It's having a biblical mission and vision in place that will drive the church to greater heights and expand the kingdom. And two churches coming together with that in mind have already placed themselves in a position above everyone else on success. If that is the primary focus, the two congregations coming together to say, let's do this together. We've not done well separately, but together with this strength, we will really pursue something strong. You're really in a great position starting out.
I think that if you go into a merger with a revival mentality, and so you're focused on outreach, you're focused on the Great Commission, you're focused on reaching people, then you're more likely to walk into it with an open-handed, humble attitude. Mm-hmm. When you have a survival, if you go into it with a survival mentality, you're going to be much more protectionistic. Like, I've got to protect our history, protect our past, protect our facility. When you have a survival mentality, you're much more open-handed. Well, yeah, maybe we sell both our facilities and we go into somewhere new, or maybe your facility is in a much better place, geographically to reach our community. So of course, we'll sell ours, and you're going to be much more open-handed because the focus isn't protecting something, it's reaching something. So yeah. There's downstream effects of that mentality.
Yeah, for sure. That's a good one. And then again, out of the first list, we're coming back to that again. The second point of making a merger successful is having turnaround leadership in place. And it's going to take that humble attitude of the pastors of both churches, or even the leadership teams, to recognize whether they are or are not skilled and equipped to lead well in revitalizing the ministry. So if they're not, now there are things that can be done. If somebody is maybe pretty good but lacks some skills, a lot of skills can be learned. And so if they're willing to be taught, then that might be might be a good thing. Otherwise, looking for a new leader for the church that could really take it into the next level and have both congregations really come together under a united mission and vision and lead well through that. That would be maybe the way to go then, is to look for a new pastor or leader for the church.
Yeah. And I think a point that Aubrey makes, it's really great, is that the pastor of this church can't be primarily like a chaplain,
Right.
who's just trying to counsel people and make them feel good. Honestly, it's a little bit like church planting in the sense where you really need to have someone at the helm who's willing to take a risk, who's willing to do things that might seem unconventional. Think an Apostle Paul type person who's willing to, take personal risk and collective risk to for the sake of the gospel and to do things unconventionally. You really need that when you're in this situation.
Yeah, and a lot of declining churches that may even be in this position are going to be older congregations. That's just the way things more so happen. And so a younger pastor, maybe more of who you'd be looking for, somebody with the energy and the ideas and the passion to really get in there with his sleeves rolled up and take on the challenge.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, our next one, our third point, is similar again to our first list, and that is having the similarity between the cultures. So recognizing the healthy aspects that are in alignment. And you can have two healthy churches that don't necessarily align on culture, because there's more than one way to do church and to be a church. And there's a lot of things that a healthy church might really kind of hone in on a particular way of going about things and doing things, and that's okay. So you can have two churches that are both about good things and have healthy cultures, but they simply don't match each other well. So this one is, it's not a checklist. I mean, you just can't put down a list of things and go, okay, look, this one, we all line up. Determining and perceiving culture takes some time, and so this is not something that just automatically say, hey, we're great. This takes conversations between groups of leaders and really diving into who each church is to make sure that it's a great marriage.
I think that as it relates to culture here, this is maybe a good transition to our point number 4 here in a second, but it may be that one church has to, particularly as in the instance of number 4, but the church may need to relinquish its culture. So it may be impossible to jive two cultures together, but it would be possible for one church to say, we're not going to presume the need to maintain our culture. Like, we're going to allow the culture of the other church our culture to be subsumed by that one. That would take a vast amount of humility, but it's happening a lot, I think, especially in churches that have, a lot of elderly people in them who are willing now to be, again, this is going to be point number 4, but be adopted by a larger, healthier church to go, it's time for our culture to be made less and for this culture to be made greater. And so we're willing to take the back seat, so to speak. So It is possible if the cultures are mismatched, it can still work, but only if one is willing to let it go, to relinquish that culture to some extent.
Yeah, that's right. Or both. And there may be the necessity of simply forming a new healthy culture. So it could be that really both churches need to leave behind their old selves and come together as a new healthy creation. So
Sure.
Yeah, number 4, okay, we're kind of dabbling into it already. And these last 2 points really get down into the nitty gritty of what would be the scenario in which most successful mergers have entered into. And so our number 4 point here is adoption instead of merger. And so the idea here is a fairly healthy or more healthy church adopts a declining, unhealthy church. They absorb in that congregation into their own, taking on, the strengths that they may have, or maybe even simply the assets that would make this church more successful. Perhaps an unhealthy church has good real property or facilities, or even cash reserves, but little spiritual health and vitality. And so a smaller, younger, more dynamic congregation could then bring in those things, and the strength of that injection just really would allow that ministry to thrive. So that's an adoption scenario, in which the church that's coming in is not really attempting to bring in their culture, their leadership, almost anything that they had remaining other than sort of hard assets. And it's kind of sad, but it's an injection, as I said, of vitality in a healthy spiritual situation that could really be great for the kingdom.
I don't know. I think it is sad. I guess I hear why you're saying it's sad, and yet on another hand, it's beautiful. I mean, we're a faith that's built on the idea of adoption, and that that God can make beautiful things out of things that are broken and not working anymore, out of things that are dead. And so this idea of adoption, a church that's healthier adopting a church that's unhealthy, and that church being willing to get a new name and a new vitality and a new heart, and bringing what it has, and then that being able to be multiplied for the impact of, I think it's a beautiful thing. So, I think that we ought to, this I think ought to be the model for churches that are looking to decline. What I would hate to see is dozens and dozens and dozens of breweries opening up. Nothing against breweries, but all these church buildings, holding on for dear life until the bitter end. And then they have to put the building up for sale, and it becomes a restaurant or a brewery or whatever, or gets bulldozed to become a parking lot because it's prime real estate. I mean, it'd be much better that while there's still a little bit of life left, that you would choose to be adopted by a healthier church, and start to leverage the assets that you have for the kingdom. It's a real option, and it's a good option, and I think it's one that churches should consider if the possibility of revitalization has eclipsed. And which is maybe a side note worth noting here. Typically, we would say if the church is averaging under, it's not a hard, fast number, AJ, but if you're under 40, 30 people, it's just real hard to get much going in terms of revitalization. Not impossible, but not likely at that size.
Yeah, that's right. It takes a special congregation and a special pastor to revitalize a church that has gotten that small. And so adoption is a lot of times a great option. Yep. Our fifth and final point is in the line of adoption, only it's just a different scenario, and that's merger to multi-site. So it would be getting adopted by a church that is multi-site. So it's not a single site church that either they start using your facility, or even if it did get sold and the money was used in a new facility. This is a church that has multi-sites, and your declining and dying church could become adopted in, and your present location then becomes a site of that church. This is another really great option, especially for healthy churches that are growing and planting sites out, from their primary location. This can be another really great way of doing it. The church, again, dies to self, basically, and becomes this new church. But it, just as in our previous point, it's a great opportunity for a congregation's legacy to live on in new life.
Yeah, there is some research on this. Barna did a study on multi-site churches, and one aspect that they looked at was this merger to multi-site thing, where multi-site churches either became multi-site because they adopted a church, or that was a part of their strategy. In any case, in 89% of the instances where a merger was a part of the multi-site strategy, it was a positive experience, which is really good. That's a really high percentage. So the difference between number 4 and number 5 here, an adoption scenario, like a pure adoption scenario, might be, I actually know of a pastor in Jacksonville who just did this. Their church was in a temporary facility. They were growing, healthy, thriving church. A declining, dying Baptist church allowed them at first to just use their facility on Sundays at a different time slot. Now, ultimately, that church has been adopted by the stronger, healthier, younger church. Now it's just one church. So that's an adoption scenario. The merger to multi-site is still adoption, but it's adoption in the way that you just described it, AJ, where you're there maybe is still a sister campus or a host campus somewhere else, and your site becomes a site of this, whether that includes virtual preaching or you may still have live local preaching. There's a lot of different models for that are happening right now. But that very often works. In fact, again, according to this research, in 89% of the situations where that happened, it was a positive experience. So that's a really viable option for you if you're in that situation. Think about that.
So there you go, the merger topic brought to you today. And I hope it's one that you'll consider, especially, a lot of our audience are considering revitalization. And if this may be a good scenario for you, we'd certainly love to talk with you about it, see what the possibilities may be of your own individual revitalization, or if not, perhaps help you look through some opportunities that you could have in becoming a healthier congregation through a merger scenario. You can reach us anytime through our website for sure. Get more information about what we do at malfersgroup.com. And today's show notes, which is the full excerpt from Look Before You Lead by Dr. Aubrey Malfers, is at malfersgroup.com/122, today's episode number. And a special thanks to Aubrey for this book. I know you don't hear from him much directly here on the podcast. He's I think only one time he was on as a guest. And has largely moved out of the public eye since retirement from Dallas Seminary. But our founder and namesake of our organization is still near and dear to us. And so we're thankful for the body of work that contributes daily to what we do, this book being one of them. So thanks for joining us this week on the Church Revitalization Podcast, and we'll be back with you again next week.